Bridget Okafor had been standing in the service bay doorway for almost 2 minutes before she finally said it. She told Nathan Reeve that her father wanted to meet him. Not as the mechanic who had caught the compression fault no one else had flagged. Not as the man who had quietly kept Meridian Transit's oldest maintenance facility running on a budget that should have broken it years ago. As the man she trusted, Nathan looked at her for a long time. He did not smile. He did not look away. Then very quietly, he told her he had already met Lawrence Okafor, and that day had cost him everything he had ever built. The garage at Meridian Transit's Eastfield Depot was nearly empty at that hour. The fluorescent banks overhead had been flickering for 3 weeks. Nathan had put in the work order twice. The third bay smelled of hydraulic fluid and cold concrete, and the particular kind of damp that seeps into a building that has been working too hard for too long. Bridget had not moved since he said it. She had prepared for a dozen different versions of this conversation. She had not prepared for this one. There was no heat in his voice. That was the part she turned over and over in the minutes she stood there, after he walked back toward the lift. No bitterness performed for her benefit, no plea for her to understand. Just the flat, settled weight of a fact he had been carrying for a long time, set down at last in the one place where it could not be stepped around. Bridget had not known. That certainty sat in her chest with a specific gravity she recognized as the weight of realizing that an entire history had existed underneath what she thought she knew. She walked to her car and sat in it without starting it, and stared at the depot's side wall until the security light flickered on and made the concrete look older than it was. She drove home with one hand on the wheel, and the question pressing against her ribs the whole way. What had Lawrence Okafor done? When? And why had Nathan never once let her see it? The house on Trelawney Crescent was 1,100 square feet, and Nathan had made it work the way he made most things work, through precision and through the absolute refusal to be defeated by a problem's scale. Iris had started grade 2 the September after they moved in. He had enrolled her himself, filled out every form at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, with the careful attention of someone who understood that the small things were not small. His mornings ran on a schedule he could have described in his sleep. Up at 5:30, Iris's lunch packed, something she would actually eat, never the granola bars she pretended to like, and left at the bottom of her bag. By 7:15, he had walked her to the corner of Dunmore and Ash and watched her until she was through the schoolyard gate. He did his job the way he had always done everything, without shortcuts, with the particular attentiveness of a man who had learned early that in mechanical systems, as in most things, the failures that kill you are the ones nobody saw coming because nobody looked. After Iris was asleep, he would sometimes sit at the kitchen table doing load calculations for a small engineering consultancy in Guelph that sent him contract work by email. The money helped. Not dramatically. But it meant Iris's winter boots were not a decision he had to postpone. He did not try to meet people. It was not a policy so much as a condition he had arrived at honestly. After Claire, after everything that followed, the kind of openness required to let someone into the actual shape of his life was something he could not hold alongside, also being the only person Iris depended on. He had put that part of himself somewhere and left it there. In his wallet he kept a photograph taken outside Sunnybrook on a Saturday in November 9 years ago. Claire was laughing at something the nurse had said. He was looking at her. On the back, in his own handwriting, was a date. He did not take it out often. He had never thrown it away. Bridget Okafor had understood from the time she was 14 that being Lawrence Okafor's daughter was not a neutral thing. It came with weight, with expectation, with the specific social weather of a man who had built Meridian Transit from a regional bus operator into one of the largest municipal fleet contractors in Ontario. She had learned to move inside that weather without being defined by it, which had required more deliberate effort than most people would have guessed from the outside. She had taken a position as Meridian's director of fleet operations 2 years earlier, after 8 years working her way through regional planning roles at 3 different municipalities. Her father had wanted her inside the company from the start. She had wanted to know first who she was without the name visible from every angle. He had accepted that eventually, with the acceptance of a man who knew how to wait. She was not naive about people. She had dated someone her father had approved of with unusual speed, which in retrospect had told her something. The relationship had ended when she realized that what he admired about her was not her, but the proximity. She had ended it cleanly and moved forward without drama. The Lakeview Connector project had been 6 months into its certification process when she found the note slipped under her office door. It was typed, 9 lines, printed on plain paper with no name at the bottom. It described a variance in the brake actuator tolerances on 12 vehicles in the Lakeview fleet. It cited the manufacturer spec, the fleet's actual load distribution, the relevant Transport Canada standard, and concluded, "I am raising this in writing because verbal concerns in maintenance environments are not always retained. Please forward to your safety team before the next inspection window." No signature. She had found out from the depot coordinator, who had slipped it under the door. She had forwarded it to her safety team, who confirmed the issue within 48 hours and corrected it before the provincial inspection. She went to thank Nathan personally the following week. He said pleasantly that he was glad it had been caught. He did not follow up, he did not mention it again, he did not position it. In the world Bridget moved through, that kind of complete disinterest in leverage was so rare it registered as something close to a foreign language. She began to pay attention. 9 years earlier, Nathan Reeve had been a different kind of man, only in circumstance, not in character. He had been 27 years old, 14 months into a position as a junior fleet systems analyst at Meridian Transit, already known internally as the one who asked inconvenient questions about component certifications and parts substitutions that technically met the minimum threshold but practically did not. He was happy. He and Claire had been married for 8 months. She was 4 months pregnant, and on the evening she told him he had stood in their kitchen for a full minute before he could find words, and then he had found too many and made her laugh so hard she had to sit down. It was the last uncomplicated night he could name precisely. The Northgate expansion was the largest contract Meridian Transit had undertaken in 6 years. Somewhere in the procurement stage, a cost reduction decision had been made. A substitution of the primary drivetrain coupling assemblies in the new fleet with a lower-grade equivalent that technically cleared a federal certification threshold but, when Nathan ran his own stress analysis, created a failure probability he was not comfortable with under the fleet's intended usage patterns. He flagged it in writing, twice, the third time he went up the chain. The meeting that followed included Lawrence Okafor. Nathan presented his analysis. The numbers were not ambiguous. Lawrence listened, asked 3 questions, and then said, with the patience of a man who had been making decisions for a long time, that the procurement had been finalized at the senior level, and that what was required now was for Nathan to countersign the certification compliance form before end of day. Nathan said he could not sign it. The room did what rooms do when someone has said the thing that cannot be unsaid. His phone rang while he was still sitting there. It was Claire. Her voice had the particular steadiness of someone working hard to keep themselves level. She was at Sunnybrook. They needed him there. The OB had found something on the scan and wanted to act on it now, and she needed him there. He asked to be excused. He was told the meeting was not concluded, that the compliance form still needed to be resolved, that his presence was required. Nathan put his pen on the table, looked at Lawrence Okafor directly, and said, "My wife is at the hospital. I am leaving." He was terminated 5 days later for professional misconduct. No severance. Benefits cut to end of month. The complication Claire had been admitted for was manageable under normal conditions. What Nathan faced now, no income, no extended health coverage, a wife who needed sustained monitoring through a high-risk pregnancy, was not normal conditions. The pregnancy did not survive. Claire did not recover cleanly from the loss, or from the financial pressure that had moved in behind it, or from the specific grief of both happening at the same time and in the same season. She held on for 8 more months. He was beside her every day he could manage, and at work every hour she was stable enough for him not to be. She died in February on a Thursday, with the small cedar candle burning on the windowsill, because she had asked him to light it, and he had. 14 months later, his older brother and sister-in-law were killed in a collision on the Trans-Canada west of Kenora. Their daughter was 20 months old. Her name was Iris. There were no relatives in a position to take her. Nathan had filed the papers himself and driven alone to Thunder Bay to bring her home. He had put her in the second bedroom, painted the walls the color of old cream, and on her first morning made her scrambled eggs and said, very simply, "Good morning. I'm your dad now. I know that's a big thing. We'll figure it out together." They had figured it out. He stood at the edge of her door some evenings and listened to her sleep, and in those moments he understood the word enough, in a way that no dictionary had ever made available to him. She was enough. She was the reason the floor held when he woke up. What he had never spoken aloud was that the name Lawrence Okafor occupied a specific locked corridor in his memory. He did not hate the man with fire. He was too tired for fire, but he knew, with the cold accuracy of someone trained to calculate failure margins, that a decision made in that meeting room had transferred the load of a company's procurement schedule onto the structure of his family. He had run that calculation many times. The answer was always the same. The first time Bridget met Iris was by accident. She came by Eastfield Depot on a Tuesday afternoon to drop off revised inspection documentation and found Nathan at the coordinator's desk with a small girl in a green wool sweater who regarded Bridget with the frank appraisal that 7-year-olds have not yet learned to soften. Bridget crouched immediately, the way people do when they mean it, and said hello. Iris said hello back, then asked whether Bridget was the lady from the main office that her dad sometimes talked to on the phone about the bus parts. Nathan said quietly, "Iris." Iris appeared to understand and returned to her coloring book. But Bridget had caught the half-second before Nathan's expression rearranged itself, and she had caught what it meant. After that, things moved the way they move when neither person is willing to name what is happening, but both are quietly making room for it. Bridget started appearing at site walkthroughs that did not strictly require her presence. She learned that Iris was in grade 2 and had recently decided she wanted to be a veterinarian, which Nathan was taking seriously with the methodical commitment of a man who took everything seriously, having already taken her to the Royal Ontario Museum's Natural History collection twice. One afternoon when the school called Nathan to collect Iris for a fever, Bridget brought soup to the depot. She sat with Iris in the break room, reading to her from a library book about wolves in a different voice for each character. Iris fell asleep against her arm. One evening at a small diner near the Eastfield stop, Iris ate most of her grilled cheese and then looked up at Bridget with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to wrap questions in tact. "Do you like my dad?" she asked. Bridget glanced at Nathan. He looked at his coffee cup. "I think your dad is one of the most honest people I've ever met," Bridget said. Iris found this answer satisfactory and returned to her grilled cheese. Walking back to the car that evening, Bridget thought about her father. Lawrence had asked about Nathan twice. In the methodical way, Lawrence asked about things he intended to file and return to. She had read it as approval. She had told herself it was a good sign. She had told herself that her father, whatever his complexities, would recognize what was real when he stood in front of it. And so she had gone back to the depot the following evening and told Nathan that her father wanted to meet him. And Nathan had told her that the day he met Lawrence Okafor, the man had destroyed his family. She asked him to say it again, not because she had misheard, because she needed the space to exist twice before she could begin to move inside it. He said it again, in the same tone, not heated, not soft, flat and factual as a torque specification. "I know your father," he said, I worked for his company. I know the kind of decisions he makes and what he's willing to move aside to make them. I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because you asked me about meeting him, and I couldn't stand in front of you and pretend there was nothing in my chest about it. She asked the question she already feared the answer to. Why had he never told her? Because I didn't come near you because of that, he said. I kept my distance from the beginning for the same reason. I tried to keep this professional. I tried to keep it from being something. She stood there absorbing that. He was telling her that he had known, the entire time, who she was, that the careful distance he had maintained had not been indifference. It had been something that looked, when she turned it over, like a form of protection, of himself, of Iris, possibly of her. That was the thing that got past her defenses more than any of the rest of it. She went home and called her father's former executive assistant, a woman named Ruth Malone, who had been with Meridian Transit for 17 years and had retired 2 years ago, and who remembered the Northgate project with the particular careful distance of someone who had thought about it more than once over the years, and was not entirely at peace with where those thoughts landed. Ruth remembered the meeting. She remembered the compliance form. She remembered Nathan Reeve. After that call, Bridget opened Meridian's archived HR database, which she had access to as a senior director. It took her 2 hours and 3 phone calls to piece together what she needed, but it pieced together. She sat at her kitchen table until past 1 in the morning with printed records around her and a cup of tea she had forgotten was there. What she felt was not simple. It was layered in the specific, heavy way of things that involve both love and complicity. She was ashamed of her family's institution in the way that is different from being ashamed of yourself. More complicated, more resistant to resolution. She was frightened by how much she wanted to see Nathan and how poorly timed that wanting was. She was exhausted in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. But underneath all of it was a decision that arrived without drama. She was not going to look away from this. She found her father the next morning in his home office. Lawrence Okafor, at 64, was a man who looked exactly like what he was. Someone who had made a great many large decisions and stood by most of them and regretted a smaller number than others might have expected. He was broad-shouldered and deliberate. With reading glasses he kept on top of his head when he wanted to signal. A conversation had his full attention. He had them on his head now. Bridget put the file on his desk and asked whether he remembered a fleet systems analyst named Nathan Reeve, who had worked at Meridian Transit 9 years ago. Lawrence said he had overseen hundreds of personnel matters during that period and could not be expected to recall every name. Bridget described the Northgate project, the parts substitution, the meeting, the compliance form. Nathan being told that the project needed him to sign something he had formally objected to in writing. Nathan leaving for the hospital. The termination that followed, the benefits that ended, what had happened to his wife. Lawrence was quiet for a long time. He said eventually that the company had been under significant contractual pressure during that period, that the procurement decision had been reviewed at multiple levels, that he did not recall the specific circumstances she was describing, but that the protocols followed had been consistent with standard practice. Standard practice, Bridget repeated. He said that every personnel decision carried consequences he could not fully anticipate, and that leadership required making difficult calls under conditions that were not always clean. His wife died, Bridget said. Their baby didn't survive. He lost everything he had in less than a year. And the thing that started it was you telling him that the project schedule outweighed his being at the hospital. Lawrence removed his glasses from his head and set them on the desk. Bridget kept going. She said the thing that was keeping her awake was not the decision itself. She understood he had not been thinking about what came after. He had been focused only on what was directly in front of him. What she could not stop returning to was that a man had been ground up by something her father had set in motion, and her father had simply continued. 9 years of quarterly earnings and fleet expansions, and the company growing exactly as intended, and somewhere in the east end of the city, a man was working maintenance shifts and raising a daughter alone, and keeping a photograph in his wallet. And none of that had ever registered as a data point on any report Lawrence had read. Lawrence said, "You love this man." It was not a question. He said it the way he said things he had arrived at through analysis. Bridget did not answer immediately. Her eyes filled. She did not look away from him. Lawrence looked at his daughter, really looked at her, in the way parents sometimes stop doing when their children become adults, and saw something in her face he had not seen before. Not the composed, measured professional presence she had built over the years. Something older, something more essential. She was standing on the other side of something from him, and she was not moving. He picked up his glasses and put them back on. He said nothing more. Bridget left and did not look back. Iris felt it the way she felt most things, through the texture of the air rather than anything she could have named. Her dad had been quieter for 4 days. He had made her dinner and helped her with her reading and done all the ordinary things, but there was a stillness to him. She recognized from the times when what he was carrying was too large to speak around naturally. She waited until Thursday evening when he was sitting on the couch, sorting through some paperwork. She climbed up beside him, folded her legs underneath her, and said without preamble, "Is Bridget not coming back?" Nathan set down the papers. She told him that when Bridget was around, it felt like the house was expecting someone. Like when they came home, there would be a light on inside that hadn't been there before. She hadn't had that feeling since she was very little, she said. She couldn't exactly remember it, but she thought it was something like that. Nathan put his arm around her, and she leaned against his side. He sat there for a while with the papers forgotten in his lap and his daughter against his ribs and something in his chest doing its best to stay arranged. That night after Iris was asleep, he called his closest friend, a man named Peter Doyle, who had known him since engineering school and who had the useful quality of listening without turning it into a performance. Nathan told him about Bridget. He told him about Lawrence. He told him all of it in sequence, which he had not done aloud before. When he finished, Peter said, "What are you afraid of?" Nathan thought about it longer than the question should have required. "I'm afraid Iris gets attached to a world that doesn't have room for her in it," he said. "I'm afraid I let her love someone, and then it falls apart, and she absorbs it quietly the way she absorbs everything, so I don't worry. I'm afraid of being the reason she learns that lesson early." Peter said, "That fear isn't going away by waiting for circumstances to change." Nathan said he knew. "She already loves her," Peter said. "You heard it tonight." Nathan said he had heard it. He sat at the kitchen table after the call with a glass of water and the city outside quiet in the winter dark. He thought about the photograph in his wallet. He thought about the day it was taken, and about the man he had been then, the one who had not yet understood what it cost to love something that could be taken. He had paid that cost in full, with interest, for 9 years. The question was whether the cost of not trying was something he was prepared to pay just as long. It was a Wednesday morning when Lawrence Okafor came to Eastfield Depot. He did not call ahead. He came in through the side entrance off the service lane and asked the first person he encountered where he could find the head mechanic. Nathan was in the parts room behind the second bay, reviewing the spring maintenance schedule when the door opened. He looked up and recognized Lawrence immediately, in the way you recognize someone you have thought about, with specificity for a very long time, with no surprise, only a kind of settling, as if the moment had always had a scheduled time, and this was it. Lawrence stood in the doorway. His coat was expensive. His expression was not. "I wanted to hear it from you," he said. Nathan set down his clipboard. He did not offer a seat. He did not reach for any particular register. He said, "All right." And then he told it the way you tell something you have rehearsed only in your own mind, not with heat, because the heat had long since cooled into something denser. He described the Northgate meeting, the compliance form, the phone call from Claire. He described asking to leave. He described being told the meeting was not concluded. He described the termination, the benefits ending, the weeks that followed. He described Claire. He did not embellish. He did not pause for effect. He gave it to Lawrence the way he would have given a failure analysis, clean and documented, without editorial commentary. Lawrence listened without interrupting. His face moved through several things that were not quite emotions and not quite their absence. "The thing I've never been able to set down," Nathan said, near the end, "isn't the job. It isn't the money. It's that on the day I needed most to be somewhere, I was told the company's schedule outweighed that need, by a man who was never going to be in a position where his own needs were outweighed by anything. That asymmetry is what broke something in me. Not rage. Just a very clear, permanent understanding of exactly how much I was worth to that company." Lawrence's gaze moved to the small corkboard above Nathan's workbench. There was a photograph pinned to it. Iris on a dock somewhere, squinting into the sun, holding a perch she'd caught with both hands. She was grinning so hard her eyes had disappeared. "Your daughter?" Lawrence asked. "My daughter," Nathan said. He told Lawrence about Iris, not as a bid for sympathy but because she was relevant. Any conversation about his life was a conversation about hers. She would walk into any future he built, and he had spent 9 years making sure she only walked into rooms that would not teach her she was worth less than she was. Lawrence said, "If I apologize to you, what would that mean?" Nathan looked at him for a moment. "An apology doesn't revise what's on a death certificate," he said. "It doesn't change what Claire went through, or what Iris goes through every time a teacher asks about her mother and she has to decide how much to say. An apology is what you offer when you've run out of other options." Lawrence was quiet. He looked at the floor, then back at Nathan. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I came here because I needed to stand in the actual place where you work and understand the real distance between where I made that decision and where it landed. I understand now that I have no standing to define what was lost or what it was worth. I understand that a man who loses what you lost because of a schedule has been wronged in a way I cannot measure from behind a boardroom table." He picked up his coat and left through the same door he had entered. The room was very quiet. Nathan stood at his bench and looked at the photograph of Iris grinning at the fish and thought about the particular weight of a man who had come somewhere he held no power and stayed anyway. Bridget did not wait. She had made herself a promise on the drive home from her father's house that she would not manage this situation by retreating into patience. That was not who she was. She did not think it was the kind of woman Nathan needed her to be. She went to Meridian's legal team and asked them to conduct a full audit of personnel terminations from the Northgate procurement period. She attended every meeting herself and made clear what she was looking for. Cases where individuals had been let go under conditions that did not meet the company's own stated standards, particularly cases involving sudden loss of benefits at acute personal moments. There were 3 such cases. Nathan's was the most significant. She brought a reparation structure to the board. She did not call it that in the presentation because language was strategic, but that was what it was. A retroactive support fund for affected former employees and their families, paired with a formal notation in the company's institutional record that the practices of that period had not met acceptable standards. The board pushed back. She held the line. 2 sessions later, it passed. She was not under any illusion that this undid anything. You cannot retroactively fund a pregnancy that did not survive. You cannot return 9 years. She did not pretend that updating institutional records was the same thing as justice. But it was the difference between an organization that acknowledged what it had done and one that simply waited for the people it had harmed to move away or stop talking about it. When it was done, she drove to Eastfield Depot on a Friday afternoon and asked for Nathan at the front. He came down in his work clothes, a little guarded in the way he had always been guarded with her, but present, looking at her directly. She told him what she had done. She did not present it as something that changed anything between them. She said she had done it because it was overdue, because it was wrong, and because she could not continue building things on a foundation that included that particular kind of unacknowledged damage without it meaning something about who she was. He listened without speaking. "I'm not asking you to feel differently about my father," she said. "I'm not asking you to feel differently about any of it. I know I can't give back what was taken. I know the shape of what you lost." She said the thing she had been turning over for days, the thing that felt truest when she stripped away everything else, that if the day ever came when he found he couldn't do this, she would still spend the rest of her career trying to make sure Iris grew up in a world that was built a little more honestly than the one that had been built on his back. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in the version of this story that doesn't belong to real people. Quieter than that. It was the change that happens when a structure discovers it no longer needs to carry a load it was never meant to carry. Small, internal, nearly invisible unless you had been watching very carefully. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "I know you mean that." "I do," she said. He looked at her for a long time, and then, for the first time, she watched him not look away. 3 weeks passed. The days between them had a different quality now, not resolved, exactly, but breathable. The distance had not fully closed, but it was no longer a wall. It was a space both of them moved through carefully, with a mutual understanding of what was still fragile and what had already quietly become something else. Iris, for her part, had been told that Bridget was someone her dad trusted, that they were still working out how to be in each other's lives, and that sometimes that took longer than it should. Iris had accepted this with the philosophical patience of a child who has noticed that adults frequently take far longer than necessary to do obvious things. Lawrence, in the weeks since his visit to Eastfield, had been quieter than Bridget could remember him being. He had stopped coming to the office at hours that broadcast authority, and had started coming at hours that indicated actual work. He had eaten dinner with Bridget twice, and both times he had asked about her projects rather than about the company's position relative to its competitors. It was a small change. It was not nothing. He had also, in his own time, and without mentioning it to Bridget until it was already complete, arranged through the company's charitable arm to establish a healthcare access fund for the families of maintenance and fleet workers employed at Meridian's active facilities. He had named it the Claire Reeve Fund. Bridget had heard about it from the finance director, who had processed the paperwork and had not been able to entirely contain his bewilderment. She had called her father. He had said, evenly, that it seemed appropriate. He had sent the full documentation to Nathan directly, with a cover letter that was 1 paragraph long and said only that he understood an apology was insufficient and was not offering one in its place. He was offering what he had. He was asking for nothing in return. On a Saturday afternoon in late April, Bridget took Iris to the park on the west side of the city, where the open field behind the community center was wide enough for kite flying. And the maple trees along the north path had just come into leaf. The kite was shaped like a red fox. Iris had picked it out. It was aerodynamically impractical, and Bridget had retied the tail twice in the parking lot before it would stay aloft. They had been there about an hour when Nathan arrived. He had come from a half shift, still in his jacket, hands in his pockets, walking across the field in the particular way he walked, unhurried but entirely deliberate, like someone who has already thought through exactly where he is going. Iris spotted him first and ran. He caught her, swung her once, set her down, and accepted the kite string she pushed into his hands with the focused authority of a child delegating a critical operational role. Bridget watched from a few yards off. The afternoon light was at that low lateral angle that belongs to spring evenings in Ontario, when the shadows go long and the air still can't decide between cold and warm. He was laughing at something Iris had said. She couldn't hear the words over the wind in the maples. He walked toward her. After a few minutes, Iris having reclaimed full command of the kite, he stood beside Bridget and looked out across the field. She told me about the fund, he said after a moment. Your father sent a letter. I heard, Bridget said. I read it. He was quiet. He didn't ask for anything. No, she said. He didn't. He put her name on it, Nathan said. He didn't need to say anything more for her to understand what that meant. Claire Reeve, 9 years gone, named on something that would keep moving in the world after all of them. Not a memorial, not a monument, a mechanism, something that acted. He stood there for a long time. Iris called out from across the field, and he raised a hand without turning. I don't know if I can forgive him completely, he said. I want to be honest with you about that. I don't think forgiveness is something I can decide into existence because it would be more convenient. It has to arrive on its own when the conditions for it are actually real. I know, Bridget said, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life standing at the place where I fell, he said. I've been standing there for 9 years. I know every stone in it. He paused. He looked at her. I think where I am right now is better than where I was, and I'd like to keep moving toward better. Bridget felt something ease in her chest that had been tight for a long time. He reached over and took her hand. It was not a gesture. He simply placed his hand around hers, there in the open field, with the red fox kite pulling against the spring wind and Iris's voice bright and carrying across the grass, and held it. From across the field, Iris looked over and saw. She turned back to the kite immediately, with the elaborate nonchalance of someone working very hard, not to show that they had been waiting for exactly this. But the smile got away from her. It always did with Iris. Near the north path, under the maples that had just come into leaf, a man in a dark coat stood alone, hands in his pockets. Lawrence Okafor did not come closer. He did not call out. He stood at the edge of what was not his to claim, and he watched. Nathan saw him. He looked at Lawrence for a long, measured moment, reading him the way he read an engine, the way he read a system under load, looking for where the truth was actually bearing weight. Then he gave one small, deliberate nod. Not forgiveness, not an invitation, a recognition that the man across the field had come, had stood in a place where he held no power, had done the one thing that was still available to him, that it was not nothing, that from here there might somewhere to go. Lawrence nodded back. Then he turned and walked away through the new leaves. Iris shouted that the kite was in crisis and required immediate assistance. Nathan let go of Bridget's hand only long enough to jog across the grass to his daughter, laughing at something she was yelling about the aerodynamic limitations of fox-shaped objects, his voice easy and warm in the April air. There are things that cannot be undone. There are apologies that cannot reach the places they need to reach, because the distance between the moment of harm and the moment of speaking is measured in years, and years are not crossable by words alone. A woman's name on a fund letterhead does not bring her back. A nod across a park does not return a decade. These are things that remain true. Remaining true is what they do, but there are also people who have been carrying something so heavy for so long that they have forgotten what their hands feel like empty. And there are moments, not redemptions, not resolutions, just honest, imperfect, forward-moving moments when the carrying pauses, when the weight is still there, in a photograph, in a wallet, in a name spoken quietly at a board meeting, in the specific shape of a grief that does not go away but does, slowly, stop being the whole of the road. When a man who has known for 9 years exactly how much he was worth to a company that discarded him, stands in an open field in April and understands, with the same precision he brings to everything, that he is still here, that the ground is still under him, that the future, which he had stopped trusting for a very long time, has not given up on requiring his attention. He came back across the field and reached for Bridget's hand again. She gave it to him. Iris ran ahead toward the fox kite that had drifted into the upper branches of a maple and was requiring rescue. The afternoon kept going the way afternoons do when the people inside them have decided, quietly and without announcement, to stay.